Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Maya Ajmera, President and CEO of the Society for Science and executive publisher of Science News. And I would like to thank you for joining today's virtual event, a conversation with Marcel LaFollette, author of the new book, Writing for Their Lives America's Pioneering Female Science Journalists. This event is produced by the Society for Science and Science News with the support of MIT Press. For those of you who may not be aware, the Society for Science started in 1921 as Science Service. For more than 100 years, the Society has been dedicated to expanding scientific literacy, access to STEM education, and scientific research. We are best known for our world class science research competitions for high school and middle school students, including the Regeneron Science Talent Search, the Regeneron International Science and Engineering Fair, and the Thermo Fisher Scientific Junior Innovators Challenge. Our Outreach and Equity STEM program that ensures that all students have an opportunity to pursue a career in STEM. And lastly, our award winning magazine, Science News, and Science News Explorers for young people. Many of you are familiar with these various aspects of Science News and the Society's work. But for those of you for whom all this is new, we encourage you to visit our websites and find out more. Now, I would like to turn things over to Elizabeth Quill, Executive Editor at Science News and the host of today's discussion.
Thank you, Maya, and welcome everyone. As Maya mentioned, I'm Elizabeth Quill, Executive Editor at Science News, and it's my great pleasure to host today's discussion with Marcel LaFollette, author of Writing for Their Lives. Today's virtual event is an opportunity to share some unique perspectives on the early history of the Society and Science News, and to hear directly from Marcel. We hope to host other virtual events like this in the future, choosing topics of interest to people like you. So keep your eyes open for upcoming programs. So now it's my great honor to introduce Marcel LaFollette. Marcel is a historian and the author of 5 previous books and 4 edited collections. She has taught at MIT, Johns Hopkins, and George Washington University. Her books include Science on the Air, which highlights early science radio shows, including Adventures in Science, a program developed by Science Service, as well as the book Reframing Scopes, about the Scopes monkey trial in July 1925, which journalists from Science News covered on the scene in Tennessee. Writing for Their Lives tells the stories of the women who pioneered science journalism at Science Service, beginning in the 1920s. So, Marcel, can you tell me about these pioneering journalists?
Oh, hello, Beth, and hello, everyone. Welcome to the discussion. Well, none of these women set out to be science journalists or science writers. There really wasn't that kind of category of job description at that point. But they all shared certain traits and interests, and they came to their work at Science Service from a lot of different paths, a lot of different backgrounds. Emily Cleveland Davis joined in 1924. She had grown up in Georgia. Her father died when she was at an early age, and her mother and Emily moved to Washington, where her mother taught school in order to support them. Emily went to local high schools. Her first job, before she ever came to Science Service, was at a question and answer service, where people would submit questions into newspapers, and the staff would go out to local libraries. There's no Wikipedia then. And find the answers to the questions, and they would be published in the newspaper. So this was good training for journalists. And Emily became quite a skilled writer, this science reporter, despite the fact that she had no training in science. She knew how to ask questions, and she was smart, intelligent, knew how to find the information. And she was also a classic sort of characteristic of her colleague, because she was an independent young woman. She and her mother would get in the car every summer in the 1920s and drive to Canada by themselves, or drive to California by themselves. Um, Probably the most well-traveled of the young women in the 1920s was Emma Ray, and Emma joined also around 1920. Emma had been born in Czechoslovakia, came to the United States with her family as a young girl, and she went to local high school. She went to George Washington University, where she got 2 degrees, earned 2 degrees in chemistry. Um, uh, Took her sorority sisters on hikes, so she was a rather energetic person. Um, she had started to work for Science Service, married, and then the marriage was starting to fall apart. So she and another friend, a newly widowed friend, decided again to hop in a Ford and drive. They were going to head to Mexico. They drove all the way to Galveston, Texas. And then Emma thought she would spend a year in Mexico working as a stringer for Science Service and other news services, selling her science stories to newspapers. She wound up staying for 8 years. She fell in love with the culture, the people, the archaeology that was going on then, and became really quite a skilled science journalist. Um, she also, fortunately, wrote a lot of letters back to her colleagues in Washington. And that correspondence preserves for us a bit of what it was like to be a single woman on your own, writing about journalism, writing about science, and trying to make a living from your journal. Um, the Another person who joined around the same time would be Jane Stafford. And Jane Stafford came from a quite different background, a more wealthy family. She grew up in Chicago, um, attended Smith College. For a while, after graduating from college, she worked for the American Medical Association, which was good training for her later because became familiar with the terminology in medicine and with the culture of the medical community. Um, and she eventually became one of the premier science medical journalists in the country. But all of these people, Jane, Emily, and their colleagues, all shared in common was a love of science, love of writing, and a real desire to communicate what they were learning about science to members of the.
They had this great passion, but they also want to write and write about science at a time when journalism and science were dominated by men. Women had only recently gotten the right to vote in this country. Can you set the scene for us a little bit? What was the cultural context?
Well, having the right to vote didn't give you the right to a job, and and certainly for all of these people who worked at Science Service, the women and the men, they were breaking barriers. They were attempting to do something in the world of science and the world of journalism, and there weren't a lot of people in elsewhere in the country who were covering science at all for newspapers. And the world of science was one that was predominantly um, uh, dominated by men. So men were at the heads of all the scientific organizations. They were chairs of all the committees, and in the laboratories, most of the people who were being trained in science then were men. So it was not that easy to move up in the ranks for a young woman and wanted to be a scientist. And the same was true in the newsrooms of the day. So if you wanted to be a journalist as a young woman, too often you were hired by a newspaper, but then assigned to cover arts or the society page. So that's part of the context they were always fighting against. On the other hand, um, they were coming into a new cultural context where opportunities were opening for women, and young women were being encouraged to move and become more independent. Their grandmothers were still wearing thick corsets and long skirts. They, in the 1920s, could start bobbing their hair and dressing in a more liberated way. So it's it's a quite different context. One more constrained, the other more open.
Yeah. And how did they all end up working at the same organization together at Science Service?
Well, that's interesting because that's a bit of serendipity. Now, first we have to acknowledge the generosity of E.W. Scripps, the generosity and the foresight. Scripps, along with his friend, the scientist William Ritter, had an idea that if you could found a science news service, something new in the 19 teens and 1920s, then you would help people to be more knowledge to help ordinary citizens to be more knowledgeable about science. So Scripps gave the money to endow a not-for-profit organization and also provided additional gifts along the way to help sustain. And he had the idea that this was not to be an organization that was just to sit on on this charitable largesse. They were also to go out and sell some of their products because he knew that you had to have products in the newspapers and one that would feel were the best product. And he also believed it was important to give the newspapers accurate science, comprehensive views. Um, and so um, that's kind of the stage. In any production, you can build the stage, but then you need the right director. So that involves a bit of serendipity. They could have hired any one of a number of people to be the first director. Quite by accident, they hired someone who happened to be a strong supporter of women's rights, who was married to a suffragist and had participated in suffrage rallies. And so he was also a pragmatist and had to find people to write for this new organization. He opened the door and he said, if you can write about science and you're interested about science, then I'll hire you or at least give you a chance. And this was an unusual opportunity for young women in science who wanted to write about science, or young women who were writers and wanted to write about science. If that hadn't happened, I think the organization, we wouldn't have had the opportunities for this group of young women. His correspondence is quite enlightening because when he's interacting with some of the struggling female writers, he's not coddling them. He's not saying, oh, that's okay. He's really giving them tough criticism, but he's opening the door and allowing them to succeed or fail on their own merit.
You've talked a little bit about the cultural context, of course. What obstacles did these journalists face on a day-to-day basis in trying to get their work done?
Well, some of the things will be very familiar: family circumstances, childcare. Many of these women were working mothers, and others had responsibilities for relationships with their parents. Um, those obligations came in from time to time to kind of to change what kind of writing or what kind of, let's say, writing circumstance. Marjorie McGill-Bright, who joined also in the early 1920s, had gotten she got a degree at William Smith College, married, and continued to take courses at Cornell. And she and her new husband were raising a family. And he, as a scientist, got a job in Washington, so they moved to Washington. She found a job with Science Service. And unfortunately, their marriage broke up and she needed to keep her job while taking care of her young son. Fortunately, Science Service in those days was a little bit more enlightened than other organizations, and they were able to handle that. Later, she remarried another scientist, and this was somebody else who was moving around the country and going to visit and going to work in labs around the world. So she couldn't do a full-time job at Science Service anymore, but Marjorie became one of their full-time and most reliable stringers, writing about science, and particularly about natural history for over 30 years. So that's one thing. The other thing that really affects all of them is the undisguised misogyny and the fact that they are often the only woman in the room, that they can't escape. You're the only, if any of the people in the audience have been the only woman in a science seminar, you know what it's like, or the only person conspic- conspicuous in your presence in a seminar. So for these young women, they were going into seminars and press conferences and trying to cover science, feeling this is what it's like. And there were many men who were not very welcoming of it. There were also scientists within the community who perhaps were not as supportive of the idea of popularizing science. To them, popularizing science was sensationalizing science. They couldn't see the importance of communicating and educating, communicating to and educating the public. So they're fighting all of those forces, but navigating that, I think, exceedingly well.
One of the key things they had to do, and we have to do today, is know our audience and how to appeal to them and how to make the science accessible and interesting. How did they navigate that? How did they approach their writings?
These were quite creative writers. They 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 were dedicated and conscientious about developing the descriptions of the science that they were covering so that it was the most accurate and the most comprehensive that they could produce. But they knew they had to entice their readers in from the beginning. And Margie Vandewater, who became really one of the premier science, social science reporters in the country, joined in 1929. Um, she's a good example because when she first joined the staff, she was not a she was not a very good writer. But over the years, she developed into quite a gifted and sophisticated stylist. Her writing is her first sentences are wonderful, pull you in. She's able to weave literature and even popular culture into her stories about science. Ellen Miles Davis, who was married to Watson Davis, the second director of Science Service, had 2 degrees in chemistry from George Washington University. She was well educated in chemistry. For the first years that she was contributing information and articles the to Science Service, she was largely uncompensated, and particularly during the Depression, money was tight. She was contributing her uh, energy and effort, but she was a really good writer, and she also was interested in poetry. So in the 1920s, she wrote poetry about science and encouraged even a competition of informal competition, inviting people to write and submit poems about science. Anything you could do. As I've also written about Elizabeth Goodwin, who drew their cartoonographs. Um, they decided to use sort of visual images as a way to engage other audiences. And they used photography when that became more possible for them in the printing process. So anything they could do to bring a reader in to engage them with the science.
And the audience is so important, but they also couldn't alienate the scientists, and they had to be careful and make sure they were networking with the scientists. We're often working within the restrictions of what information we can get access to and when papers are published. What kind of limitations to access did these journalists face, and how did that affect their work?
Well, there are two kinds of restrictions. One is, as you know, the informal, the restrictions on access and the attempts news management by either professional society or community. And the other would be the more formal. So the informal kind of attempts at news management, uh, they learned how to again navigate the waters to keep calm and carry on sometimes against the criticism. It is pretty remarkable to read through some of the correspondence in the 1930s and find people like B.F. Skinner, who at the American Psychological Association meeting decided that he would bring in all of the science journalists and make sure that they read the abstracts to them and made sure the journalists understood the abstract as an attempt to be sure that they were not over what the psychologists regarded as over sensationalizing the psychology. And Margie Vanderwater was also very much involved in a lot of that. The medical community also wanted very much to manage the way in which medicine was presented, so they were constantly up against that. And then as they got closer in the late 1930s and to the 1940s with government censorship related to World War II, journalists were having to navigate that process. Journalists who knew about physics were probably well aware of what was going on with the atomic bomb project. So they actually knew how to voluntarily decide what to publish and what not to publish. Um, in medicine, Jane Stafford knew that some of the things that were that the Office of Censorship would like to keep quiet might be useful information for um, her readers. And these women were always concerned about the lives of their audience. So if you had someone who was in the military in the Pacific, you might be concerned about the threat of malaria and knew about the shortage of quinine. So Jane Stafford was engaged at one point with the censors trying to figure out how soon she could publish information about a possible substitute for treatment of malaria. Always again negotiating with sources of the information with the interests of the readers.
And Jane really pushed for that access. I mean, she went on to co-found the National Association of Science Writers and was kind of very active in giving journalists a platform in some sense.
Yes, and it was a real insult to her that many times when she was invited to a medical seminar, and then they said, "Oh, my goodness, you can't come because we're having it at a men-only club." And her boss at one point, her boss, Watson Davis, pointed out to the organizer, "Well, you're going to be honoring the National Association of Science Writers, and she's one of the founders of that association. How can you say she can't attend the seminar?" Um, he pushed back, but unfortunately, the organizer of that particular seminar didn't get the message. Eventually, they did.
And some of what they covered was genuine breaking news with obvious and immediate societal implications, both in the area of health. But can you also describe how they cover the dropping of the atomic bomb?
Yes, this was for, for the ones who happened to be in the office in August of 1945. This was the biggest story of their lives. So when the news came out over the wire services, on the morning of the August 6th, most people would have greeted that information as that news is information relating to the ending of science reporters, science journalists knew this was also an enormous science. Watson Davis happened to be traveling abroad, so there were only 5 of the writers left in the office, and they decided to split up the topics. Helen Miles Davis covered the chemistry, Jane Stafford covered the medicine, and physiology. Um, Martha Morrow, who was then their physics editor, covered the physics. Uh, Frank Thone, who's the biology editor, covered the biology, and Margie Vanderwater covered the psychological and social impacts of this new weapon. Then they a little bit by the end at that point between August 6th and August 9th, they only knew that 2 bombs had exploded and a civilian had been killed. Then on August 10th, the SMIDE report was released, and this was the official technical report talking about that told about the science behind the development of the bomb. At that point, there were only 3 of the writers left in the news office: Helen, Jane, and Marjorie. And as I was going to be sure I get the quote right, as Helen later wrote to her daughter Charlotte, "When we 3 get together and our talents, you'd be surprised what a good physicist we make." So they went to work uh, and covered the some of the and got information out to their wire service. One of the things that I've come to admire about these women, as I've gotten to know them through the years, through their correspondence, is both their concern, their ability to cooperate and collaborate. And that was certainly a collaborative effort. That particular reporting, uh, part of their reporting. But the other was their concern and empathy for for the people outside of the news office, for the world outside of the news office. And again, I want to just read to you one thing from Margie Vanderwater. Later, she said in an essay that talked about how frantic it was in the newsroom in August 1955. The phone was ringing off the hook. People were asking them, explain what's happening, what this is all about. But then she said later, it was not possible to think of anything else except one stupendous fact: atomic fission, atomic power, atomic destruction, unlimited, except for the unpredictable desires of the human heart. That was a sensitivity to other aspects beyond the science that I think really shine through the lives of these.
That's really powerful. Reading the text, I was struck by kind of how little has changed in the spirit of the job and the mission of the job and what the journalists hope to achieve, but how much has changed in the technology. What do you think have been the most dramatic changes between then and now?
Well, of course, the course of the period that I'm writing, when they first start, they're using typewriters, and actually sometimes they're hand writing out their articles by hand, and then it's typed up, and then it's headed sent off to a compositor and then to a printer. Um, they're interacting with their scientists with scientists whose work they're covering. They're interacting by letter. So they write a letter to someone and they have to wait a couple of days for the response in the mail. By the time you get to the late 1930s, they're increasingly using the telephone. The cost has dropped and they can use long distance telephone. They've used telegram, uh, tel- they've wired things back and forth, but really the telephone then changes the immediacy of reporting. Uh, But for the historian, that means we have fewer records. You're lucky if someone has phone up to their ear and they're writing notes on the side and they say, so what changes then from then to now is the immediacy and the accessibility of your potential interview subject. When Anne Ewing was interviewing Oppenheimer, after Oppenheimer announced that he was resigning from the institute, and she had found out that in fact it was because of his illness, she wanted to interview him, and she could arrange an interview on the telephone. Now, of course, journalists routinely text, email, interview by Zoom, whatever, and you don't have to be in the same space, in the same time zone. Um, you have much more access. You have access has changed a lot. Um, so yeah, that's part of also who's writing and how they're getting credit and how the information is flowing out to the audience. The audience is certainly much wider. And the feedback is probably for you also much more immediate than it was for them. They had to wait to get a letter in the mail by somebody who's complaining about how they phrased something. But
Well, I'd now like to open the floor to questions from our audience. We've already received quite a few, but I encourage you to continue to submit questions and we'll get to as many as we can. So, one of the first audience questions, Marcel, is what inspired you to write a book based on the history of science news and the early journalists who wrote for Science Service?
well, as you mentioned, I've already had written books about the radio programs done by Science Service. Right, become interested in science on the radio, and then found the Adventures in Science program and science on television. So print was probably a natural thing for me to go back to. My early work had looked at images of science. And the the Me Too movement, a lot of efforts to re- revise and rediscover the work of women. It turns out that not only do we tend to not do a history of journalism in general is not as robust as it could be. The history of science journalism is not as robust as it could be, and by a number of different circumstances, I needed a new project, and I started looking through the records to see what women were there. I had blogged about some of them, and discovered there was a lot more information. Folder, 4 folders later, there might be a letter, and then another 5 folders, there would be another letter. And then by the time I was finished over a couple of years, I had pulled together more about these women's lives. My goal has always been to write this book and hope that others will build on it. All of these women deserve their own biography. Go for it.
Is there someone from the book who you feel like you'd like to read about first? Read more about first?
Well, there was another question I think that let me pick up on, and that's sort of like the thing, who'd you like to have around the dining table? And for me, um, one sort of dream would have been to have all of these women, Jane, Marjorie, Emily, 2 Marjories, Emma, have them all around the same table and let them just talk about what their lives were like and what it was like being a woman in journalism in Washington, um, in the world of science at that point. So, I mean, I'd like to know more about all. One of the things that we're missing, and again, a plea to all of you who have people in your lives who you care about, who may possibly have diaries and records that are tucked away somewhere. Um, we need to save those material for the historians of the future. I would not be able to have read you that little passage from Helen Miles Davis' letter to her daughter Charlotte had it not been for the Davis family and one of Helen's granddaughters who has saved the correspondence and transcribed it for us to use. So save that material for us in the future.
So I think the question you were referring to, I'll jump to that one, is if the women journalists featured in writing for their lives could time travel to the present day, what changes in science, technology, or society do you think would amaze and inspire them the most?
I think they would be amazed at the number of women in science, the number of women in prominent places in science. They certainly would be encouraged that so many women are leading your organization. Um, the women in journalism. We have women as the editors of publication. I was struck by there was a piece, I think it was in either today's or yesterday's New York Times, a piece by Gina Colada. And she mentioned she's describing her own reporting on a particular topic. And she mentioned in the article that she had been assigned this by her editor, who, and I it was a woman. And that's a change because editors of newspapers or the assignment editors in newspapers were male in the days of these women. So that makes a big difference. And I think just the power of this next generation coming up, every time I'm around somebody who's in their teens and 20s and is interested in science, like,
Well, speaking of that, this question comes from a 16-year-old who is dedicated to scientific research with a passion for journalism. And they ask, is there a common denominator between the women in your book and yourself in life's path, or a defining moment that sparked their interest in science journalism or yours in writing about their work?
excellent question. That's an excellent question. I mean, serendipity. Um, I mean, every once in a while when I was still teaching, someone would come and sit in my office and say, "How did you get to be where you are?" And a little luck, being in the right place at the right time, a little persistence, sometimes taking a risk. Um, I think that's probably the common denominator. And occasionally, in my case, there were men who were in positions of authority, like an advisor, physics advisor, who said, "Okay, I know you don't really want to become a physicist, even though you're majoring in physics, but what we're going to need are people who can talk about physics to the public." And so he encouraged me to apply to Boston University for their first program in science communication. So sometimes it takes that. Um, I think if that's what you want to do, if that's your passion, go for it. And that's one thing they all had. They all persisted. They kept going no matter what. And I don't think they were doing it for the credit, for the byline, or I think they probably will be amazed that we're writing about them and remembering them, but I don't think they played.
I think you mentioned in the book that credit was something of an issue, that a lot of them didn't get credit for their work or didn't have their bylines published.
Well, that's part of the that was part of the organization. They were producing an enormous amount of content. They were writing short pieces, long pieces, the pieces that were the full page feature articles, those would go out with byline. The short pieces that they sent out to the warehouse services, that was going out without a byline. So you had to really care about communicating to the public, not be so preoccupied with your own ego, mm, um, to be able to do this job. And that was true for the men and the women that worked at science service in those days. And for women, uh, sometimes there, at least in the 1920s, it probably was a way for them to get things published, um, if their name did not.
Mm, that makes sense. Nowadays, some journalists do everything: print, radio, TV. Back then, did the women focus on one area? Print, radio or TV? Was print most common?
Well, for for the people that I'm writing about, they were primarily, although Emily Davis became the script editor for Adventures in Science, uncredited. She would take a scientist paper that had been delivered at a um, meeting, and the scientists, and take that paper and turn it into an interview script with saying Watson Davis question and then answer from a scientist, and she'd make that something, essentially turn it into a radio script, turn it over to Watson, and then he would have the scientist on the air and interview. So she got quite good at that. And Jane Stafford did some interview on the radio as well. To the best of my knowledge, none of them did television because they were really largely before the television era.
Some areas of science been more accessible to the reporting by women journalists than others. And are there areas that you think women gravitate toward?
Perhaps no. I mean, what is pretty interesting for me is that in the 1920s, they were covering the whole grain. I mean, if it was science, they wrote about it. And since in some cases we don't really have, I can't trace a particular published article to the author, I can infer who was being assigned what by initials that are in the margins. Um, but with all of these physics, chemistry, astronomy, um, uh, and as well as the social sciences, which maybe traditionally work for women. You've got Emily Davis, who really was she was carving a new path as someone who was focusing on archaeology and anthropology at a time when those are really exciting areas of endeavor. Wrote two books on the subject, two very well. So I don't think they were necessarily feeling at that point that there was anything that they couldn't write about.
Do you feel like that changed over time, or do you feel that all areas are equally open to women even today?
I think they should be open. I think they should be open to women. I don't
Hmm.
see that they are. I could see perhaps somebody feels that they don't want to write on that, something or other. I mean, Jane Stafford was a very proper uh, young woman, and then a woman in her 30s and 40s. And if the photos in the book or any, the photos we have of her, she was extremely proper. Um, she loved wearing big orchid and pearls occasionally, even when she's sitting at her desk. but she also had become engaged in the effort to inform Americans about um, uh, sexually transmitted diseases and the new treatments for sexually transmitted diseases. So she's actually writing about things like syphilis in her science service publication. Um, that was an important issue in the 1930s, and she knew it was important for the lives of her readers.
What, if anything, surprised you in your work on this book?
Um, that's an interesting surprise. I suppose they. I shouldn't. I'm not surprised now, but perhaps in the beginning, the level of cooperation and collaboration, the humor. That's always a delight because the one thing that they all seem to have in common and probably kept them going during hard times was a sense of humor and a sense of proportion. They knew how to laugh together. Um, and occasionally you can do nothing but sort of shake your head and gasp at the undisguised misogyny and the comments like, no, you can't come to our meeting because it's in the Harvard Club, and the Harvard Club only admits men. Um, so I think that's probably those would be the surprises. But I mind a lot of I had written about science popularization um, for for most of my career. So the resistance of the scientific community at the time to popularization. So,
Nowadays, both Science News and the New York Times science section cover developments in mathematics and statistics as well as computers. Did that happen in the period you described?
um, they they did cover mathematics. I think they probably weren't as that wasn't as significant an area for them in the 1920s, and but in the 30s, computers became yes, computers and information science became very important. And Watson Davis himself, the second director of Science Service, was very interested in information science and trying to develop new ways of working on microfilm, microfiche, um, saw that as the future. He was interacting with H.G. Wells, and they were thinking about the world brain. That sounds like the World Wide Web, or something like that. So, yes, they were starting to cover those things. They occasionally were interested in new languages. Mm, so computers were part of that. And Helen and Watson Davis's daughter, Charlotte, is turned out to be as she um, later in her career became one of the important people in computer science. That's
The time in which the journalists in the book were writing, there was a lot of junk science and anti science, much like today. Did they see it as their role to actively combat this, or did they feel they needed to remain neutral to be published or heard?
now that's an interesting question because the answer is both. So yes, they're trying not to take sides in a scientific dispute. Uh, if there was a genuine dispute over something in a field, when it came to the anti-evolution movement and the Scopes trial, as I've written about it in Reframing Scopes, they were jumping in and they were no longer neutral. Uh, they were roundly on the side of evolution and against people who were wanting to keep evolution out of the schools. Um, but I think they, when it, for topics that were what we might call fringe science or uh, things that were questionable, they were always very cautious. They were exceedingly cautious about the research being done by Ryan on ESP. And occasionally you'll find a letter that a scientist has written, or somebody who says that he's a scientist. And you'll see Watson Davis or someone else writing in the margin, careful, be careful about this one, or we won't publish this one. So they were trying to filter out some of that. They were under a lot of pressure from time to time from trustees who wanted them to be tougher on some of what they saw as marginal science and not sort of mainstream.
Mm.
So yes, they're always working on that. They're always sort of thinking about that topic, but trying to do it in a way that, again, serving their readers by not being overly censoring, but also not serving up something that wouldn't be credible.
Here's another reader question or another audience question. What significant or tangible changes have you observed in the way that women are represented or honored in science today versus in the past?
Uh, well, as I've written in Making Science Our Own, which talks about images of science, I mean, I think might, we certainly have moved on from some of the more misogynistic descriptions of women, where if you were going to talk about a woman scientist, you had to make sure to assure your readers that she was also domestic and knew how to cook and clean, etc. Um, and those are sort of the classic things from the first part of the 20th century. And it continues on into the 40s and 50s and even the 60s. So I think we have moved beyond that. I think we will have um, definitely moved to a new stage when the Nobel Prizes are announced and it's physicist wins Nobel Prize, and then maybe a paragraph down, uh, her family life is mentioned. Um, Not to diminish the family life, but just that it's not that for a woman scientist to win the Nobel Prize is no longer unusual. So eventually, we hopefully will get to that stage. But yes, I think it's that we're much, at least publications, responsible publications, are much more sensitive to that. And as someone who was gifted by my mother with a name that is spelled in the male way, um, there are books of mine that were reviewed where the reviewer very authoritatively refers to me as he. So I'm used to that. Um, and I think we're now at least becoming more enlightened about who's who.
And this question kind of piggybacks off the last one, I think. What can teachers do to encourage young science students in middle and high school to to pursue jobs that are traditionally occupied by men, especially those young girls from underrepresented or traditionally excluded communities?
I think it's to encourage young people to follow their passion. If you're interested in science, that should be no barrier. It's whether you care about physics, whether you care about chemistry or the neurosciences, and whether you're able to do it. So the more math you take, the more science you take, the better. And if it turns out that you do all of that you major in science or major in math, and then you don't become a mathematician or a physicist, that doesn't mean that you won't use that knowledge and that ability to think through problems in whatever career you then choose. So it seems to me that it's an excellent starting place. And if you then want to go on with it, go. But it's like having a good grounding in literature.
You've set us up for the next question, which is somewhat of the flip of that is how would you encourage more journalism students to take STEM classes?
For the same reason. Just think of what we've just been through with the pandemic. To be able to understand the biology, the physiology, the all of the scientific aspects of the coronavirus and what was going on. was also very important when, even if you were, you're a local reporter and talking about, let's say, restrictions and on masking, things that became very political. So you're a political reporter. It would be helpful to know the science behind what you're reporting about. So understanding science and having that again in your toolkit going to become a journalist seems to me only the sensible thing going forward, even if you wind up being the political reporter or someone who's a drama critic or a theater movie critic. How could you write a good review of Oppenheimer without having some science back?
Agreed. Do you have any sense of the access and role of women journalists in science in countries or regions of the world other than the US, either historically or today?
Hmm, that's a good question. It's not my area of expertise, and it's really waiting to be. I think that's there- it it's a fascinating topic, and I hope the records are there. And I'd love to see the book.
So, a little bit more personal question to you. Of the women journalists you describe in the book, who do you identify with the most?
Oh goodness. Um, well, I don't think I'd get in the Ford and drive to Mexico, but it's hard not to just fall in love with Anna Ray because of everything that she went through. um, and I have a lot of empathy for her experiences as a young person. Um, my goodness. What? No, I think they were all wonderful in different ways. Um, they knew how to love and they knew how to laugh. Um, so there were I didn't have any favorites. But I think we all the people in the archives fell in love with Elizabeth Sabin Goodwin because and you can go to the bigger picture blog to see the story of discovering who she was with the help of the internet community, the greater community, digital community. We discovered her identity, and then that led to the to me being able to identify original drawings in the Smithsonian records as Elizabeth's drawings. So we brought her back to the historical record, and that was fun because then her granddaughter came first. She came to life. But I had no idea.
Can you talk a little bit more about those records and kind of all that they contain and what it's like to go through them and, maybe whether your access changed during the pandemic, if that became more challenging for you as a historian?
I was very lucky I had done most of the research before, right when the pandemic hit, because you could not get into to the archives or to the Library of Congress or any, so everything was restricted. So I had everything. I had more than enough to write about. I was actually chopping. Couldn't put it all in one small book. But the joy of going through those records is that they can contain just about anything, and it's the marginal notes. I think that the marginal notes, the postscripts, the things that are the inadvertent descriptions in the middle of professional correspondence where
Mm.
someone talks about what she's doing in her personal life. I loved it when I'm a theater fan, so I loved it when Jane Stafford talked about the stage plays she'd seen in New York, and or about books that she was reading. So that's the joy of it, and to see it on the page. There's a place in which um, at one moment in history, someone is changing a script, and they're pasting changes that because of events in the external world, they're changing the script and they're pasting pieces of paper on top of the script.
Wow.
That's reporting for life in film.
And what is your next project? Can you give us a window into what you're doing next?
I've got two. I've got one that I've finished the draft of a book that's a biography of George Washington Rapelier, who was the scallywag, the scamp, wild guy who talked Scopes into being the patsy at the Scopes trial and who became a friend of Watson Davis. But he had a very interesting life. He was an inventor, a power book salesman, you name it. There's kind of that is kind of a was kind of fun project. Um, and then a more serious project about the photographs of Julian People Scott, a man who had lost most of his hearing in childhood and then went to Woods Hole along with another scientist, with a scientist who volunteered to help him during World War I, and wound up taking some of the most evocative and beautiful photographs of scientists who would pose for him at Woods Hole and then later in laboratories around the country. And so I just had finished the inventory of all those that are in the Smithsonian collection to write about that because Julian Scott was a fantastic photographer, but also an advocate for the deaf. That is an interesting man.
That sound like fascinating projects. We can all look forward to hearing more about them. I'm sorry to say that that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you, Marcel. This has been wonderful. Now I'll turn things over to Science News Media Group's publisher, Michael Voss, for some brief closing remarks.
Thank
Thank you, Beth. Hello, everyone. As Beth mentioned, I'm Michael Voss, publisher of Science News Media Group. And before we close, I'd like to take a brief moment to thank some people. First, let me thank Marcel for joining us today and sharing some additional insights and anecdotes about the amazing women journalists who played such a pivotal role in founding not only the Society for Science and Science News, but for helping to shape the modern field of science journalism. I'd also like to thank Beth for leading today's discussion with Marcel, and I'd like to thank the production team who worked to ensure that today's event went smoothly. I also want to take a moment and thank the MIT Press, publishers of Marcel's book, whose support helped make today's event possible. Visit their website, mitpress.mit.edu, to learn more about new titles. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for attending today's event. As Beth mentioned at the top of our time today, we hope to produce more of these virtual events in the future. If you're interested in finding out more about these events or any of our other activities at the Society, or want to keep abreast of the latest developments in science, I encourage you to sign up for Science News and the Society's emails. You can find links to sign up for either newsletter by using this QR code that you see on the screen. I'd also encourage you to help support us in our work to expand scientific literacy and access to STEM education and scientific research by subscribing to Science News or making a donation to the Society, links for which can also be found by following the same QR code. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.